Hey everyone, I just opened up the Zoom. Frank Cardullo is pulling up his slides and we will start the meeting in just a minute or two. And my name is not Reed Golf, so I'm going to change that. I am not a cat, Judge, I assure you. There we go. Frank looks great.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, let me make a few announcements while we're letting people roll in, and we'll start. Hey everyone, my name is Walter Gordon. I'm the chairman of the AIAA Niagara Frontier section. I'm going to introduce our speaker, Frank Cardullo, in a moment. I just want to go over a few ground rules for the talk. Frank will be answering questions at the end. Submit questions via the Q&A button, not the chat button. Depending on the mood I'm in, if you submit questions via the chat button, I will either abuse you or disconnect you from the talk. So ask questions using the Q&A button. And also don't use the raise hand button because I'm not going to pay any attention to that. For any questions or comments after the talk, like if you want to request a copy of the video, send them to nf.aiaa@gmail.com. That's for Niagara Frontier, nf.aiaa@gmail.com. Our next talk in July will be July 15th, and the title is Hexagon, the Spy Satellite That Helped Win the Cold War. Just several days ago was the 50th anniversary of the first launch of the Hexagon spy satellite on a Titan 3D out of Vandenberg. That was the first spy satellite that was really referred to as a big bird, and was the last of the great film return spy satellites before they went to digital. And we're going to have a 3-person panel to discuss that in July, 3 men who were there and participated in the program. But with that, I'd like to introduce Frank Cardullo, Emeritus Professor of Mechanical Engineering at SUNY Binghamton, who has spent the vast majority of his life in flight simulation, extending the state-of-the-art of flight simulation, both in aircraft and in spacecraft. I'm not going to regurgitate the description you read in the announcement. I'm just going to hand it off to him for flight simulation from pre-World War I to the present day. So Frank, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Walter. It's indeed a pleasure to be asked to make this presentation this evening. And I hope you all will enjoy it. So let's see, it didn't, there we go. This will be kind of a chronological, but not exactly chronological presentation. I'll kind of follow these topics, which are quasi chronological, but in the end, so I'll go through a history, and even though space flight simulation ends up somewhere in the middle of the history, I will save it for the end and have a bunch of slides and talk mainly about the Apollo simulation. And I cut my teeth actually on simulation on the Apollo simulators. I was going to look at some of these problem areas, and I'll mention them a bit as I go through, but I think we're going to save that for maybe another day because I don't want to run too long here. So I'll proceed with the pre-World War I flight training, and in particular the pre-blue box era. And of course, I think everybody's familiar with that term, the blue box. It's what Ed Link's invention, which he had patented in 1929. And that sort of became a trademark. not legally. The patent, there was a patent, but not a trademark on the term blue box. But you know, there was a lot of simulation of various sorts. This this chap, Vladimirovich Gilshers, he had a gardenery trainer, and it noticed that it had a motion platform, and he was able to tilt it. It's not clear from the picture how many degrees of freedom he had. I'm sure he had no more than 2. And I don't know what kind of training he got. And the gunnery that, if you notice on the top here, he's got a long rifle strapped to the top. So I have no idea if that was a live fire thing or totally a simulation, or how it was scored, or if this guy in the background was a victim. In any case, then there was Carl Fink. He had a cockpit crew trainer. I have no idea how this thing worked. This was in 1916, so right around time of the First World War. It looked like it might have some bank capability, and he had some straw down here, I guess, in case he fell out. But nevertheless, I'm not sure how much training he got out of that. Now, the Internet aircraft training devices, this was an interesting one. The pictures show the Internet training device. I thought I had a picture of the actual aircraft, but it was a French aircraft pre-World War I, and they built this training device. Notice the strange control inceptors here, not what we're accustomed to, but that's what the aircraft actually had, the Internet aircraft. And so the training device, they believed in motion, and motion has become almost a belief issue in flight simulation. So, and you either believe it or you don't believe it in most cases, unless you're wedded to one side and then you have a firm belief. But they certainly thought that getting used to being able to roll and yaw an aircraft was important, and so they had these helpers on the ground to help with the environmental physiological effects or perceptual effects. Then another German pilot, Franz Drexler, he had this flight simulator. He also believed in motion. It looked like, this looks like it would do both pitch and roll, but he had no instruments. He was just looking at the horizon, and I guess the idea was to just get a sense of a correlation between motion, a kind of motion that you don't get riding a horse, and what you might get in an airplane. He probably thought it was important to stimulate the vestibular system, but I'm not sure he knew what it was. So then this was a trainer built around 1910, and this was one of a group of ground-based wind-generated trainers. Again, you see what the influence here is to indoctrinate people. Indoctrinate's not a good word. To expose people to degrees of freedom that they don't normally get walking around or riding a horse, and so this device would reorient itself according to the wind, and pulling back or pushing forward on the controls these wings would gain some lift, and the rudder as well. So once again, similar ideas. One of the problems, no wind, no training. So then we enter EdLink. So EdLink lived in Binghamton, New York, and his father had a piano and organ factory, and he became very prominent for his invention on the blue box and much of what came later. So actually, there were three major pioneers in simulation: EdLink, Richard de Hemel, who worked at Bell Labs, and he came up with an electronic version of a flight simulator. EdLink's was all mechanical, at least initially. Admiral Louis de Florez was obviously in the Navy, and he was a very strong force in convincing the Navy to invest heavily in ground-based simulation. And the AIAA now actually honors him with annual awards in flight simulation. So EdLink, after World War I, there was little effort in training areas, training aids at all. EdLink got very interested in aviation, and he took flying lessons, and then he got the idea that he was 16 years old when he got his first driving flying lessons, but he got the idea about trying to train to fly using a ground-based device, because it was very expensive. They didn't have a lot of money, and it was very expensive to pay for flying lessons. So if you notice on this slide, up in the upper right-hand corner here, is a picture of the inside of a Link automatic piano, and it used a vacuum system, and you play the piano rolls, and the valves opened and closed appropriately and caused the playing of the keys, and it provided music. And they used it in theaters, and you pressed the button and you got music. Well, EdLink approached the problem of building a flight trainer, he drew upon the technology that he had perceived firsthand, using a vacuum pump and a motor, and a bellows system to actually operate his design. He was very anxious and dedicated towards the fact that that it was important to provide motion once again to the pilots, and so he built his first device and patented it in 1929. And he, as the slide said, he built it in his basement, and you can notice that the number on the airplane, on the simulator, is the same as the tail number on his first airplane. So the wings on here, the length of the wings were determined by the size of the freight elevator in which he could get the simulator in and out, or the trainer in and out of the basement of his father's factory. So and here's a picture of a very early version. He didn't even have it painted yet, and Ed Link in it, and he says he's flying. The caption says he's flying the first Link trainer, so we'll take his word for it. Amelia Earhart became an early user. Here's this picture of her. She's one of the earliest pilots who got involved with flying any of Ed's devices. But she had a flying school, and ultimately she ended up ordering one or more for her flying school. So by 1933, Ed added instruments. This is actually a more modern version. It's actually, you notice it's painted blue. But in this cross section, you can see where all the vacuum devices were and everything. And so more or less, prior to this time, if you moved the controls, he had some mechanical linkage between the controls and the pneumatic bellows and the valves on the pneumatic bellows, and he was able to then correspondingly pitch and roll the device based on those inputs from the pilot. So there were no flight dynamics involved in this, and so, but there's an interesting story that once he added instruments, and then the instruments were electronic. They were driven by servo motors, and they still were no real flight dynamics. But he was able to teach people to fly using instruments and making appropriate manipulation based on the and manipulation of the control based on the instruments. But an interesting story occurred. Ed was in communication with the Army because the they heard that that he had this device, and the Army had taken over the delivery of airmail from the Postal Service. And so he had to fly into an airport in New Jersey to meet with members of the committee that were deciding on the purchase of training devices to train the Army pilots deliver the mail. Well, it turned out it was a very, very bad day, very rainy, low cloud ceiling, and these folks were gathered at the airport. I don't remember off the top of my head if it was Teterboro or some one of those airports in New Jersey, but they were gathered there, and they were about to give up because the weather was so bad, the rain and cloud cover, and all of a sudden they heard the engine of his airplane, and he proceeded to land in very low ceiling, taxied over to where they were, and he told them that he completely learned to fly instruments on his trainer. So they signed him up. So here's an example at the factory of the simulators, and that he sold to the and this was 1934. He sold to the Army for instrument training. So we move into the war years, mainly the Second World War. And so the RAF purchased a number of Link flight trainers, as did the Canadian RAF. And in fact, for both the British and the Canadians to buy the Link trainers, Link had to build a factory in Canada, just across the St. Lawrence River, to produce the simulators that they would buy. And you see here the famous crawler. This was a navigation tracker that recorded the cross-country flying of the pilot. And notice that the hood is down, and so the pilot's flying completely on instruments. So around this time, he actually was getting some civilian customers, airlines and flight schools. I mentioned before Amelia Earhart, but as you can see on this slide, that some of the airlines actually were using the blue box back in that period of time. And a number of the airlines, beginning with American Airlines, also used the device. So this was Randolph Field, and you can see the lineup of simulators, Link flight trainers on both sides, and this extended back into the picture. And this was repeated at a lot of Army Air Corps bases throughout the country. And thousands of World War II pilots got their preliminary pilot training in these linked blue boxes. And you can see here the stanchion for the controller, the crawler. Also, in the early days of the war, the British Royal Air Force purchased these celestial navigation trainers. And Ed built these in a silo, and they actually turned out to be full crew trainers of a sort. And you can see here you have a ground map on a transparency with light illuminating from below, and above you have the celestial sphere, and they could practice navigating with a sextant and shooting stars, and at the same time the cockpit crew was navigating. And the RAF bought a few of these. The PBM-3 was a Navy device. It was designated device 2F1. Was flying boat, and Martin built the airplane, and it's not exactly clear whether this was a link simulator or a simulator from Curtis Wright. And more about the Curtis Wright issue in a couple of minutes. One other device that was designed was a cyclorama. So up until this time, there was virtually no visual kind of scenery. Well, they take the inside of the silo or any other circular shape space and paint some ground features on it, and you have the ability to pitch and roll the device, and there were fiducias on the painting, and so the pilot could correlate his pitch angle with respect to this device. So this is one of the first beyond the silo, one of the first that tried to correlate in any extent motion and visual. So we proceed. Another device. I'm not sure what the date of this is, but it was a biplane, and it was a cyclorama type device, and it had the prop disc on the front. So to give the pilot the cues associated with having to look around the prop disc. So Curtis Wright, how did they get involved? Well, Dr. DeMel had conceived in the mid-30s a simulator type device that was all electronic, and up to this point, Ed Link's devices were all mechanical, and the only electronics were in the driving of the instruments and that sort of things with torque motors, etc. But this was all electronic, analog computing, and and so this is, you can see, is Eastern Airlines. And this is where the pilot entered. This is where the instructor sat, is the pilot station and the instructor station. So they sold a very large number of these. So DeMel actually didn't get the patent until after they started building these things. And I don't really understand how this worked, but he licensed, before he got the patent, he licensed the production of these to Curtis Wright. And I don't know, unless things were a lot less litigious in those days, and people trusted each other more, perhaps. They went ahead and built a number of these, but in the end, they built a few other types, but they shut down the simulator operation, and then eventually shut down their aircraft operations. So we move into the post-war years. And after the war, the military interest in flight training waned, and Ed Link was looking for other ways to make money and sell simulators. So he developed this thing he called the School Link, and so he tried to sell these to high schools and colleges, and they were intended to help teach math and science as well as flying. They never caught on, and the effort ended after about 3 years. So in the meantime, he got an award from based on his flight simulator work, and at a big banquet at which he was presented his scientific achievement award. This picture was taken with Anne Morrow Lindbergh, who was, of course, the wife of her famous husband. This was the first jet trainer. Originally, it was made for the F-80 aircraft. This was a link-built device. It was electromechanical and fixed base. So now they were departing from the motion, but they had no visual either. So it was strictly a procedures type trainer, and it taught the pilots how to correlate the instruments with the dynamics of the airplane, which were programmed analog. And the C-11B around 1950, and that was the F-80 shooting star. It got modernized, and here is the instructor station, the pilot station, and a picture of some of the servo mechanisms for driving instruments, etc. F-102 was the first supersonic simulator in 1995, still largely or completely electronic analog. And so with the analog computer simulators that had flight dynamics models, so that the airplane, the simulator responded appropriately with as would be expected in the specified aircraft. So all the functions of the aerodynamics, lift versus angle of attack, pitching moment versus angle of attack, aircraft aerodynamic coefficients as a function of airspeed, altitude, etc. They were all programmed on these analog function generators, which this is an example. So everything, later on, these became data tables in a digital flight computer and digital flight simulator, and much easier to deal with, much less hardware and the accompanying failures. (106) aircraft is still analog. Then it came the B-29, military aircraft, but it had a commercial counterpart, the B-377. And this was a luxurious transport aircraft, and people had bunks and they could fly across the ocean. And the simulator, this simulator was built by Curtiss-Wright. And it might have been among the last, I'm really not sure. And here's a little bit more of a close-up, and you can see the flight crew up here, the flight engineer here, and the instructor here. This says it's the first simulator purchased by an airline, maybe from Curtiss-Wright, but you saw the earlier ones. Very early on, some of the airlines were purchasing trainers. So as we move into the late 50s, we have the DC-8 being the first commercial jet simulator, and as I recall, this was also the first digital computer flight simulator built by Link. And the Douglas test pilot went to Link, and he had about 35 hours in the simulator prior to flying the first flight in the DC-8. So he was able to spend much less time in training, and this is one of the convincing issues that the commercial airlines had for becoming interested in using flight simulators for training. And this type of simulator, actually, I think this was a 707 simulator, and they went back to adding motion, and this was a 3 degree of freedom motion system. And that the issue of motion, no motion, as I indicated at the outset, was a profound problem, and so there were believers and disbelievers, and the issues are much more complicated because of the interaction with visual systems. And notice these simulators up to this point didn't really have much in the way of visual systems. In around 1967, Link came up with, some would say, an updated blue box. It was the GAT-1, was a single engine light aircraft simulator. And this was also analog. And so the GAT was a single engine airplane. Later on came a GAT-2, which was a single engine turboprop, and a GAT-3, which was a small general aviation jet, all electronic trainer. No visuals, but here we start to get some of the visuals. And they crept in all along in this chronology. But so visual systems and simulators have, they must have some kind of an image generator. They've got to generate an image, and then they've got to be able to display that image. So, so the image generator in this case was a painted scene on this somewhat cylindrical transparency, and then it had a horizon, and then below it was nothing, and it was driven. It was gimbaled and driven, and so as the airplane pitched, the horizon pitched. As the airplane rolled, the horizon rolled, all driven by this electric motor gimbal system. Later on, oh, looks like I lost a slide in here. I had another slide that was also a relatively early on system with slightly different technology, but it was basically this very rudimentary, and somewhere along the line they got dubbed Sky Earth systems, even though there was no actual, no picture of sky necessarily or Earth. But later on, some of these camera model systems came along, and so this is a model of the terrain, and you have a gantry carrying a camera with very specific type lenses that could get down in among objects on this on this board and actually give a fairly realistic view, because they eventually became color. And the big drawback to these was the limited terrain area that you had. And then you still needed something else to generate clouds and sky. Used a lot of power, as you can see here. And the other slide that I had was a predecessor to this, which was a moving belt display. So it was all black and white, monochrome, and it had a belt, and the belt moved, and it was continuous, was narrow. It was suitable primarily for practicing landings, where you got set up on the glide slope to a landing, and then it was a pretty good device. And this was an expansion of that. These had airport facilities on these boards as well. Then we moved into the computer generated imagery, pioneered by Ivan Sunderland and David Evans, forming the company Evans and Sutherland. And their first device was an LDSI. And it was monochromatic, very rudimentary. I remember seeing one of these when they were shopping it around to different simulator companies that might be interested in support the development. And it was very, very rudimentary. It was monochromatic, had the scene that they had was an aircraft carrier, and they could manipulate the bank angle and pitch angle of the carrier with respect to the airplane and with respect to the sea. But there was no real sea. The sea was black. And I guess most people didn't buy it because the camera model system seemed to be so much more realistic. But they went on, and the rest is history, because they developed highly sophisticated systems that ended up looking like this. And then the visual part of the industry expanded very, very rapidly. And here's an image of a helicopter simulator. And so remember, I said that there are two issues. You generate the image, and then you have to display the image. So with the computer generated imagery, if I go back for a moment to this picture was taken from off the face of a CRT that was being generated in response to some aircraft following this aircraft. And the question then became, how do you display it? Well, in this, you can see that this is in the inside of a big dome with a continuous display. And there were various means of displaying these computer generated images. This is another one. And the cockpit, in this case, there is an open cockpit, which was unrealistic, of course, because you wouldn't be flying an airplane like this. And this had a faceted display. As you can see, the lines in the display. So there are discontinuities, and these aberrations are somewhat problematic. But most problematic about these types of displays, and here you see a F-22 Raptor simulator. These faceted displays are very close to the pilot's eye. And here you can see the rail of the simulator cockpit actually is cut into the display screen, into one of the facets of the display screen. So one of the fundamental tenets of displaying imagery in a simulator, that objects should appear to be at a distance. And for that, for real image displays, and I won't go into the difference between real image and virtual images here, but you might remember it from your college physics classes. Most simulator images these days are real images. So the problem with a real image is the image is at the distance that it actually is. And these were just a couple of feet in front of the pilot. And this is somewhat problematic. In the domes were a radius of about 10 feet. And there the convergence angle on the objects in the scene are getting small enough that they appear to be far away. But with these faceted devices, they don't. And they build a lot of these. And what drives them is that the Air Force and to some extent the Navy want to put these things on carriers. Air Force want to be able to put them on a transport airplane, bring them to some place, have them in a container. And so what's constricting the display fidelity is logistics. But that's the way it is. And engineers will always comply to come up with a solution, even if it doesn't make sense. So anyway, we move on and we go through this period of special access programs, and you see the SR-71, the B-2, the F-117. This is here on a motion system. And so here's a Delta Airlines Boeing 737-900 flight simulator. So this is a very modern device. And you can see the imagery out the window. This is most of the civil transport simulators use virtual image displays, and they're on a continuous screen, and you don't see a lot of the aberrations that you see with those other kinds of devices. And here's an A320 simulator, and the instructor and the cockpit crew, and 6 degree of freedom, so-called hexapod motion system. Now, the kind of simulation that I have been talking about is ground-based simulation. There's a whole other kind of simulation that's not usually used for training pilots, but used for research and largely control law development for the automatic flight control systems. And CalSpan in the Buffalo area have a number of aircraft, which you see here, that are called in-flight simulators. And there are modifications made to the aerodynamic surfaces that can be manipulated and make the airplane fly like a different kind of airplane. And when they do the research and design development work, there is a safety pilot and experimental pilot in each of these devices. And so the safety pilot is there in the event that the aircraft runs away under the experimental conditions. You can shut off all the augmentation devices and get back to the basic airframe and safely bring the airplane home. So the last little bit of my talk is going where no earthlings had gone before, and that is going into space. And so we started with the Mercury program, and this is a Mercury simulator, and I believe this was actually built by McDonnell Douglas. I was not at all involved. I was just a boy then. And so I was still in school. And this is John Glenn in the Mercury simulator. And it was basically a procedures trainer. Then the next space program was a Gemini program. And so while Mercury was a single astronaut, first couple flights were suborbital flights, and then John Glenn was the first orbital flight, and the rest of them were orbital flights of varying length. Gemini was 2 astronauts, and it was really the precursor for the Apollo program. They experimentally solved the problems that were anticipated. For one, was rendezvous and docking was going to be necessary for a lunar mission. So they practiced rendezvous and docking with a Gina spacecraft that was launched into appropriate orbit. They rendezvoused, and the Agena had a docking collar on it, and so they were able to dock. A second issue was they conducted spacewalks. And the third issue I forgot, I'm sorry. And my notes are gone here for some reason. But so there was the docking, there was tethered spacewalk. Oh, shoot. And there was a third thing that that was part of the mission requirements.
Long endurance, I bet, Frank. Long endurance?
Well, it was long endurance, sure. That was a factor. But there was another, anyway.
It was also the first to be able to change their orbit. Mercury could not change their orbit.
Yeah, that's true. It's not the one I was thinking of, though. But nevertheless, there were a bunch of things, obviously, that were precursors that they needed to demonstrate that could be executed in space if a mission to the moon were to be successful. And then came the Apollo simulators. Here is the lunar module simulator and the command module simulator, the lunar module simulator. And these were two simulators for the space shuttle. This was a launch and re-entry landing simulator, and this was an on-orbit simulator. And I'll have more to say about the Apollo simulators in a bit. But in addition to training, these simulators played a major role in the recovery effort for the Apollo 13, the Apollo simulators. But on the way there, most people even forget the existence of the Skylab program. And Skylab was a program for solar physics experiments, to conduct solar physics experiments in orbit outside of the atmospheric issues, and by humans that could make judgments as they proceeded. And so this simulator was also built by Link, and I worked on this one. My system was the control moment gyro attitude control system, but mostly almost exclusively it was solar physics. There were some issues associated with, can humans live in space? Can they eat? Can they socialize? Can they sleep? So this was really the first space station. And then we move on to Apollo. So the Apollo mission simulators were extraordinary devices, absolutely extraordinary. They simulated the entire cislunar mission. So from launch into Earth orbit, and a maneuver to remove the lunar module from its from the S4B stage and attach it to the command module for the translunar missions. So the translunar injection, lunar orbit insertion, the dashed lines indicate on the back side of the moon, and coming around, and after a couple of orbits through what was referred to as high gate and then low gate, and then finally approach and landing. And there were a lot of different parts of the simulator used in these different modes of the mission. And then the return involved the launch, rendezvous with the command module, service module in orbit, perform the appropriate burns, dump the lunar module, come on back, re-enter, Earth orbit insertion, and water landing. So the simulators that were involved in training the astronauts to do these were the command module simulator, here the brown device, and the lunar module simulator. Now this is at the Kennedy Space Center. And there are actually 2 command module simulators in this bay at this end. So this picture was taken from the top of that other command module simulator. So ultimately, there were 5 simulators built, 3 command module simulators, and these are mission simulators. There are a lot of other part task simulation devices, but total mission simulators, there were 5. 2 were at Houston, 1 of each, and the 3 at here at KSC. And I'll be talking about this a little later on, but the lunar module simulator had this landing and ascent model. This was basically a camera model system. The top part here is the model of the lunar surface, particular for each landing mission on the moon. So it was a different model for each lunar mission that was appropriate for the particular landing site. And it's upside down, and I'll show another picture of that later. And that's because of the magnification issue, dust would loom as mountains. So it was a way to keep it from getting dusty. There were many similarities in the visual systems. All of this apparatus around this, the command module simulator, lunar module, is all part of the visual system. And I'll talk about the individual components in a bit. So in the command module simulator, so you might recognize that this is where the 3 astronauts, the command spacecraft commander, and other 2 astronauts. And then there was this lower equipment bay, which was down below, and it was at a lower level. And there was some storage areas down there, and also the toilet that the astronauts used was called a fecal canister. You got to deal with biological problems. Urine was dealt with other ways, but feces were dealt in that strange looking can down there, which you can't see in this picture. But more importantly to our discussion, we have a sextant and a telescope. And in the next image, you get a close-up of the 2. And you see a person at them. So one of the most difficult problems that we encountered was there was in the simulator to reproduce, because of the technology of the well, this was in the sort of mid to late 60s, but the technology was much earlier. And to be the accuracy, computer word length, I believe was 8-bit word length. And it was horrendous problems to deal with driving these electromechanical devices. And so when the astronauts were approaching, they were in lunar orbit and they were doing landmark tracking. They were supposed to be able to acquire the landmark in the telescope, which had a 5-degree field of view, and center the landmark in that 5-degree field of view, and that if they switched to the sextant, which had a 0.5-degree field of view, it would be centered there, and they would use that to read off gimbal angles to input into the onboard computer that would govern course correction, propulsion system burns. And that was very tricky to actually make that happen in the simulator. It happens in real life if you define the system properly, but you're confined by the problems associated with word length, electromechanical systems, film accuracy, all kinds of things. So that was actually an interesting aspect of trying to get that to work. Oops. So there were many elements of optical elements of the visual system, and actually this is not the slide that I wanted. So there were several different systems for displaying certain aspects. So there was something called the emission effects projector, which actually showed its basis was orbital film, and it had equations derived based on the orbital mechanics, and there were 3 film cassettes that you could shift from one cassette to the other as you had continuous orbits about the Earth or about the moon. And so the orbital mechanics involving orbital inclination, perigee, apogee, and all that sort of stuff was all in the mathematical models, and the films were driven on that basis in the emission effects projector. And they were displayed in the windows and in the telescope. There was a sextant, which I mentioned, and the sextant in the command module was different than the sextant in the, I'm sorry, the sextant was used for shooting stars mainly, and also for landmark tracking. And its image source was slides. And then there was the celestial sphere, which had this constellation of stars. And astronauts could actually shoot these stars with a traditional sextant out the window. And again, make the calculations and put gimbal angles in and into the computer to aid for navigation. These weren't used for burns as far as I know. They were just used for navigation. And the star field was amazing. It was an invention of an optical engineer at Ferrand Optical by the name of Joe, my good friend Joe, what's his name? Joe LaRussa. And there were ball bearings on the outside of a sphere, mounted appropriately based on their locations in the sky. And the reflectivity of they were stainless steel balls. The reflectivity of the appropriate reflectivity determined its size and characteristics, so that you got the right magnitude of star. And so here's Neil Armstrong in the LEMS simulator. And you can just barely see the window there. I mentioned the landing and ascent table. This is what it looks like. This was a massive device, and it was massive such that it would be not affected by any kind of vibrations in the building or anything to affect accuracy. And this is the lunarscape and the optics of this device. And what it looked like in the lunar module simulator, if you looked out the telescope or the windows. And that's another thing that I should mention. There were multiple windows, and you know, in an airplane, you might have windows on the left side of the airplane and on the right side of the airplane. But for the most part, especially in civil transport airplanes, you don't bank that much. You don't roll 360 degrees or pitch 360 degrees or yaw completely around, but you can in the spacecraft. So each window had to have its own calculations of what should be there at the right magnification for its distance and all of that. The mission effects projector math model, this was not code, this was later coded into assembly language, but the math model itself was about 300 pages. So there are a lot of equations in this, and logic, and lots of logic. And so this is an image of mission control during Apollo 13. And the simulators had a major role in bringing the crew back, because the trajectory, the return trajectory had to be completely different. They weren't going to land, they weren't going to come off the surface of the moon, but they were going to go around the moon and slingshot back. And so the onboard computer had to be reprogrammed, and the development of that program was done on the ground theoretically. And then, well, you might have seen this in Apollo 13 film, although there they just talk about the logic stuff. But in the simulator, they had to verify that the predicted trajectories in burns, propulsion system burns, would result in the appropriate trajectories. And that was all done in the simulator. And simulator engineers and the controllers all got presidential medals for the work they did on that. And what you see in this picture is they had to adapt the environmental control system because the explosion took out part of the environmental control system. So they had to use stuff they had on board, tubing and extra filters that they had to modify the ECS so that when they were in the spacecraft, and they, as everyone knows, they used the LEM as a lifeboat. They could make it home. So that brings me to the end, and so I mentioned these sticky flight simulation problems, and it's got to do with visual, motion, and control force feedback. It's human in the loop control, and there are all kinds of problems that get upset. So this, in the modern day of flight simulation, where we've got great technology, great computing machines and stuff, we're still not doing a really good job of dealing with these integrated problems, perceptually integrated problems. And maybe at another time we can have a talk about that. So I thank you for your attention. I'm sorry it went longer. But I hope it was interesting. So I can take any questions if you have any.
Okay, thank you very much, Frank. And Frank has offered to cover some of these sticky problems in another session in a lunch and learn. Some of you who are on the mailing list for the Niagara Frontier section, you know, we had a lunch and learn about green propulsion, and we're thinking of having another one where Frank talks to some of these modern issues that, despite all the technology we have, are still issues today. So if you'd like to see that, I wouldn't mind if you send an email to nf.aiaa@gmail.com if you'd like to hear that lunch and learn. We do have several questions. The first one, I thought this was interesting. Why did Link and others bother to put wings and tails on the simulators? In some photos, it actually looks like they had working ailerons.
Yeah, well, of course, I wasn't around at the time, but those are only EDs, and or largely EDs, and I guess it was for perhaps some psychological basis, that someone climbing into this simulated aircraft that had wings and a tail helped the illusion, perhaps. And there actually is, this is not my particular area, but there's a lot of human factors, you know, touch and feel and cushion kinds of things that and that they think really contribute to it. But what's interesting about that is that the length of the wings was determined by the size of the freight elevator because the simulator, the blue box was built in Ed's father's organ and piano company basement. And they had to take it out on the freight elevator. So the wings, I guess they didn't want to take the wings off or put them on later. So they were sized. That comes from the textbook, The Pilot Maker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, we have another question. It seems that flight simulators are going way beyond simply the training role. And as an example, the questioner asks, this is George Barata, who's actually joining us from Portugal. He's up in the middle of the night. He said, with VTOL aircraft such as the F-35, the simulators were used with skilled pilots to actually help develop the flight control system. Do you have any comments about that?
Oh, that's absolutely true. You know, if I had gotten into the totally other aspect of all the aircraft companies, and by the way, it's of interest, all the automobile companies these days use simulators for developing flight control laws. They use them for other things, force and fit and comfort and all of that. But the major thing is developing the control laws. And it's been a while, actually, that they've been doing that. And not only the control laws, but when they make certain aerodynamic decisions and they model it and then put it in the simulator and then see how it works and how the pilot interacts with it. So this could be a complete talk all on its own. So I refer to that as the sort of the handling qualities aspects of using flight simulators. And it's not just military aircraft, but it's the civil transports as well. And even more so, going through what Boeing went through for the MAX problems. All that stuff was run out in the simulators, and testing whether pilots could handle certain situations. So yeah, that's a good question.
Have another one about the effect of pilot or organizational culture at a particular company or military service on the acceptance of flight simulation versus actually flying in the aircraft. And I was wondering if you could give us an example of a military service in or out of the US, or a particular airline that was either wholeheartedly embraced or more pushed against flight simulation versus actual flying training in your experience.
Well, you know, I don't have any kind of data on this, but I think it's more of a problem in the military than it is in the transport world, because most pilots that join the military to fly airplanes, not simulators. Where I don't think the civil transport pilots have that same perspective. They that's a job, and and they can, simulators can be a lot more effective and efficient at practicing certain things. And I think that in the absence of data, it's all anecdotal, that civil transport pilots are much less adverse to using a simulator. For one example, so if you got to shoot some landings, you know how long it takes to shoot landings in the airplanes that you flew, right? And so you can do 5 probably in the amount of time in a simulator that you can in the airplane.
Right.
And so so I think, you know, they'd rather be doing other things in the commercial world, but there is that bias in the military that they join to fly airplanes, not simulators.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This is maybe a little bit of an extension of that military aspect, though perhaps not. I think you'll recall at SciTech several years ago. Do you have a glass of wine there?
Pardon me?
Do you have a glass of wine there?
Oh yeah, I just finished dinner just before we started, and I have leftover wine.
Well, I have a single malt scotch, so it just made me smile. It's become a tradition where my wife brings me one halfway through the talk, maybe because she thinks I'm going to lose my nerve. But anyway, at SciTech several years ago, I think you'll recall John Tilko, who's actually on this Zoom with us right now, set up a terrific session with Dave Scott and a number of other folks, and they were talking about the Bell LLRV and LLTV, the Lunar Landing Research and Training Vehicles that we here in Western New York are extremely proud of. And I think Dave Scott said during that session, and I know I've read it by several other astronauts, that they said it makes a difference when your butt is on the line and you have to land this thing in one piece before you run out of gas. And they felt the LLRV and the LLTV was in a more effective simulator because of that. Now back then, I know the alternative ground-based simulators that they had for landing the lunar module were relatively poor so far as handling the dynamics of the situation. And I think today there would be no LLRV and LLTV likely. But do you think that's a factor? Have there been psychological studies of that?
Yeah, most of my knowledge about that is anecdotal, but they generally refer to it as the pucker factor that's missing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's just no way you're going to get around. But I will tell you one thing. I was, when we were checking out the command module simulator and the lunar module simulator at Kennedy, and I spent 6 months of my life there doing that after all the design work up here. But I was shooting re-entries, and I got in an unstable mode, and I was sweating trying to figure out how. I was literally sweating because I had this, and you're right, this was technology, 1960, late 1950 technology. But I was literally sweating that I wasn't going to be able, I was going to burn up on re-entry. So it was probably my youthful naivete.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we've used up all our questions. We've run a little long, but it was terrific. One of the questions was, so when can this lunch and learn happen? So we already have a request to hold the lunch and learn on current issues. So I think we probably will schedule that. But unless there are no more questions, Frank, this was terrific. Thank you very much. Those who are still on the line, it was recorded. If you'd like to review it or send a copy of the recording to someone else, shoot us an email at the section website, which I've already said too many times, the section email address, so I won't repeat it. But again, thank you very much, Frank. We'll talk to you soon, and everybody have a great evening.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Good night, all.